Good morning, and welcome to week 6 and chapter 6 for business ethics. Got another interesting topic this week is on individual factors, moral philosophies, and values. So this kind of strikes to the heart of business ethics in general. And learning objectives for the week are understand how moral philosophies and values influence individual and group ethical decision making. Compare and contrast the theological, non-theological, virtue and justice perspectives of moral philosophy, and discuss the moral philosophies on business ethics, and recognize the stages of cognitive moral development and its shortcomings. Then an introduction to white-collar crime as it relates to moral philosophies, values, and corporate culture. Before we get to a little bit more on the topic at hand, I did want to go over our week 6 discussion board topic. And again, throwing another tough one at you. I want you to really be thinking about a lot of present day and interesting topics that we're currently facing. This one has a few different elements to it. First is, in the lockdown period for COVID-19, many essential workers stayed on the job. Many were medical professionals, others full-time workers in industries that were deemed essential. But there also were many gig economy workers, and they maintained lower wage income jobs, making the deliveries of food, groceries, as well as other essentials. One of the questions is this: is it fair for us to stay safely tucked away in our homes and shift our risks on people who do not have the luxury of doing so? So we had a lot of folks that were out there on the front lines. They were making deliveries. They were working in restaurants so that we could come and pick our meals up or have them delivered. Obviously, the people in the medical professions, but there were other businesses that did the same. And is it ethically and morally fair that just a certain amount of people took the greatest amount of risk for all of us? Again, medical professionals, I'm sure we all understand that's kind of part of what they sign up for, and hopefully many, if not most of them, are rewarded decently for doing so. But there were a lot of low-end workers, even in packing plants and things like that were deemed essential, that were not maybe rewarded, or maybe their risks were put in peril just for the sake of the greater number of people. So I want you to think about that a little bit and find just think about the pros and cons of that. Now, there were some that were deemed essential that were in residual industries, like my wife, for instance, worked for our former business, the folks that bought it, in the agricultural equipment industry. So, there are a lot of different types of folks that were deemed essential, but there were many that had the luxury of being able to work from home and do their jobs from home, maintain full pay, and then over and above that, they were able to further shift their risks on other people by having everything delivered in, staying in about 100% of the time. So what are the parameters of that? What's fair, what's not? We all know what we did. We all know how it worked, but was that necessarily ethical? Was it moral? Was it fair? So anyway, we'll kind of kick that around for this week. The other thing that I wanted to do is talk a little bit about a few other larger issues. One of the things when it comes to individual ethics that we have to look at is it's always this balance of what's good for the individual versus what's good for the greater good. What's good for the larger society, what's good for the larger culture. And so we constantly fight these battles. How much do I emphasize and prioritize what's good for me as an individual versus what's good for the larger number of people. Now, typically in a democracy and typically in a society that we've thought of ourselves, at least, as being Americans and the Western civilizations and the free world, we've at least talked a pretty good game of about wanting to balance the needs between the individual and the greater good. But if you look at business in general, and particularly if you look at large businesses and corporations and Wall Street, there are many signs that that's not necessarily what always happens. So how do we balance all that? How is that fit? That's what we struggle with every day. Now we've got a new thing recently in the 2020 election. The New York Times got a hold of somehow Trump's tax information for the last 15 or 20 years. And it highlights that, at least according to their account, he has paid little to no taxes over the last 15 to 20 years. In some cases, actually throwing off losses and getting refunds. So don't mean to pick on this issue specifically, although it's going to be a big issue in the elections, but looking at it in the larger sphere, this is not unusual. Warren Buffett, people like Warren Buffett have raised this, that there are many years that he pays a lower effective tax rate as one of the richest men on the globe, in the top 5 at least. He pays a lower effective tax rate than the secretary that works for him, or the administrative people that work for him, or most of the employees that work for him. And he has openly questioned, is that fair? Now, he's openly questioned it, but he's obviously taken advantage of all the benefits that make that possible for him. So what is fairness, particularly in business, particularly in public companies? Because by nature, public companies, pretty much their goal is to maximize shareholder value, maximize return on investment. So that should be a CEO's primary goal in a public company. So how do we balance that against weighing things out for the greater good of society and even individuals? The other question that's interesting about individual ethics is diving in a little bit more and asking ourselves, why are we good? Well, we're at a faith-based and values-based university, and Newman University, so many of us might say we're good because it's morally ethical and it's right, and it's part of our religious faith. And nothing wrong with that. That's great for people that have those faiths. What about people, which is getting to be a larger percentage of our population? What about the people that don't share the tenets of any faith? What about people that don't have a base religion in their life? What's in it for them? Why would they be good? Well, there are larger issues, just moralistic issues, in which people still, even though they don't maybe believe in God or they don't believe in a higher being, they still want to be good. And I'll give you an example. I've got 2 friends I can think of, and I've thought about these 2 quite a bit. One is very religious, I would almost say hyper-religious, and he goes to church every weekend, every Sunday, even on religious holidays, things like that, and lives a very virtuous life in terms of a dogma and a religion. And then I've got another individual that is not religious at all and doesn't think there's anything on the other side. He thinks when you die, and that's it. But this person is still very moralistic, very ethical, lives probably as good of a life from a morals and an ethics and a virtue standpoint as any card-carrying Catholic or any religious person that I know. Doesn't think there's anything out there for them, doesn't think there's any particular reason other than the fact that it's the right way to do things. So ask yourself this: who is actually more deserving of God's virtue and grace? The person who's doing all of this because they think there's something in it for them, or the person who's doing it just because they think it's the right thing to do? Now, I don't mean to question anybody's faith or religion or anything like that, but I've thought about that question before. I mean, you've got a person over here that doesn't think there's anything in it for them, but they're still living about as good of a life as I've ever seen, about as good to people as I've ever seen, about as virtuous as I've ever seen. And then you have other people that seem to be doing all of that same stuff, but they're doing it for a specific reason because they think it's God's will or God's rules or God's demands. And furthermore, they think at the end of the road, when they die, they're going to get eternal heaven and grace because of that. So who's more deserving of that? The person who thinks there's nothing in it for them, or the person who's doing it primarily because they think there's a reward at the end of the trail for them? So I think there's definitely virtue in both ways, right? I'm not trying to talk anybody out of their faith, but it is amazing to think that there are people that are out there, they don't necessarily think there's anything in it for them. They don't think there's anything at the end of the line. They're just doing it because they want to live a good, virtuous, moralistic life. And they do believe in the greater good. So why are we good? Why do we try to be good? Now, there's others, they're as good as they have to be to make sure they're in compliance for laws, our legal system, and for rules and regulations. Right? So whether it's an organization that says you can only take so long a lunch hour and you have to work so many hours, and they make sure they dot all the I's and cross all the T's and meet all those guidelines, or whether it's the legal environment. Maybe it could be legal regulations and rules that you have to meet for if you're in the finance business or things like that. They meet all of those rules and regulations as well, and they don't break any formal laws. But they're going to push the laws as far as they can possibly push them, even if it means that they're going to get huge advantages, maybe not rightfully so, maybe not even fair, but they're legal, so they're going to push it. And that's where you get back to tax law. That's where you get back to the tax code. There are a lot of things that are put in there. They're sweetheart deals. They're buried in these tax codes for people, and most wealthy people and most people with means take full advantage of everything that they possibly can on those. So if we're going to be good, if we're going to be virtuous, if we're going to have a moral life, how do we balance it? How do we define it? So think about those type of things as you go through this week's content. Think about your own lives. Think about those around you. Think about if you know people like I just described, somebody that's really good, virtuous, leads a wonderful life, leads a very moral and ethical life, but they're atheists. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in any type of formal religion, but they still do all the right things. And then think about, I'm sure most of us can think of a person who goes to church every day, who does all of the religious thing, they check all of the boxes, but deep down, they're not really very good people. When they're outside of the church, when they're outside of those constraints, they tend to do some really questionable, really horrific things to people around them. You just ran into a situation with Franklin Graham and his wife. Franklin Graham was the head of Liberty University. His dad was Billy Graham, and it came out that him and his wife have been doing some really unspeakable things in their personal lives while they're basically preaching to all of the people that go to their evangelical university. that they can't drink, they can't smoke, they can't have sex outside of marriage, all of these other things. So you see cases all around of people that look pious, they look like they're the model of religious virtue, but they tend to do some really unethical things on the side. So think about your own lifescape and think about how we judge people and how we judge others. And does how we judge people, does how we look at whether someone's moral, ethical, and virtuistic, does it have to be looked at on multiple levels instead of maybe just one or two? Okay? And all of this ties back into business, because if you want to have an ethical business, or if you want to have an ethical team or department within a business, it makes a world of difference in terms of the type of people you hire. If you hire scoundrels, if you hire people that are unethical, you're not going to be able to have a good ethical business. It just doesn't work. And so you got to really look at people on multiple levels when you're going to hire them. When you're going to bring them in the door of your business, you better be thinking about things very much like this. And also be thinking about things of people that look very pious, look very ethical on the outside, but when you start doing a little more research and you start digging a little deeper, sometimes what's behind that facade doesn't really match up. So you got to be able to judge people more than just skin deep, more than just surface level. All right, well, that'll get us for this week, I think. Be sure and keep me posted if I can help you with anything or if you have any questions. I've really enjoyed reading your papers and your discussion board posts. I read every one of them and have really enjoyed it, and keep them coming. I hope you all are enjoying the class so far. Be sure and stay safe and keep following the rules as the university has laid out. Hopefully we'll be able to get through this whole semester. We're been doing pretty good so far, so let's keep it going. All right, well, thank you all, and we'll talk to you again next week.